All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Better Buildings, Better Plants Summit. I want to thank you for joining us today. We are going to have a really wonderful session prepared and some fantastic speakers. We're hoping to make this somewhat interactive, so hopefully we'll have some participation from all of the attendees as well. But before we dive in, there's a few housekeeping points I'd like to cover. Please note that today's session will be recorded and archived on the Better Building Solutions Center. We will follow up when today's recording and slides are made available. Next, attendees, each of you do have the option to share your video as well as unmute yourself in this format. That said, we are going to ask that you keep yourself muted when not speaking to avoid any background noise, as I know we have a large number of folks joining us today. If you do experience any audio or visual issues at any time throughout today's session, please send a message to tech support in your chat window located at the bottom of the Zoom panel, and we'll do our best to help you as quickly as possible. All right, so we'll look at the agenda really quickly. So thank you again for joining us today. We're going to kick this session off with some introductions. We'll have a brief presentation, and then we're going to hand things off to three esteemed guest speakers that represent the architecture, engineering, and construction trades and spaces. Throughout this session, we hope to hear from you via the Slido interactive platform. We'll wrap up at the end of the session with plenty of time for questions. So a few things that we hope you can take away from today's session. So first, we'll hope that you can learn how architects, engineers, and contractors can really be your partners in delivering owners better buildings. We hope that you can hear from leading architecture, engineering, and construction firms on strategies of how to achieve zero in your buildings. And lastly, gain tips on finding, hiring, and collaborating with the right firms. One quick note here I want to mention, you'll see us refer to zero buildings throughout today's presentation. We generally mean this to mean buildings that are ultra high performing from an energy efficiency standpoint, often with site EUIs in the 20s or even lower depending on the building type. We see this level of efficiency as putting buildings in the sweet spot to achieve zero energy or zero carbon goals if and when paired with appropriate renewables. So if you can kind of so that's how we'll be using the term kind of zero buildings, is these ultra high performance buildings. We know that there's an increasing number of organizations and governments that are setting either zero carbon or low carbon goals. And we hope this session can really provide some takeaway and practical applications and how you can make tangible advances in those goals today. So I'm your moderator. My name is Zaleski. I'm a senior advisor at DOE's Building Technologies Office. I've been here for a bit over a decade, and currently I lead our commercial building zero energy work, our work with the design community, and also a number of other initiatives at the building and district and city scale. So I'm also pleased to be joined today by Paul Torcellini and Sammy Houssainy from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And they are really my co-conspirators in this effort. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing to engage the A, E, and C communities and what that means for some of your work and how to improve your buildings. Later today, we're going to be hear from three other experts that we collaborate in this effort with, and we'll introduce them on a few slides. So thanks again for being with us today. A quick note on social media. We hope you'll join the conversation on social media. So here's the information on how to do that. I'll leave this up for just a second so everyone can take a look. All right. So for folks that have been in other sessions with us in years past or earlier this week, we're excited to announce that we're also using Slido today. This is an interactive platform for questions and answers, polling, which we'll use quite a bit throughout today's session, and also to provide session feedback. So folks can please take a minute to use either another web browser or your mobile device to go to slido.com. When you get there, you'll open a new window, or when you get there, you'll see a place for an event code. Our event code is DOE. And once you enter this event code, you'll be able to select today's session that we're in right now, which again is the role of architects, engineers, and contractors in zero carbon buildings. So you can use this platform to ask our panelists questions. You can submit them in Slido at any time throughout the presentation, and we'll be kind of collecting and triaging those to address later on in the presentation. We're also going to use this to ask you all some things about where you're from, what you do, what some of your goals are, and how you go about, collaborating with your contractors and design firms as well. So I'll give everyone a minute just to bring that up. All right. So with that, I think we are actually going to give Slido a whirl with our first poll. Well, thank you for showing. So it's a little bit what it looks like in the Slido app. Okay, and I think we're gonna, if we can go ahead and move to the next slide, we're gonna ask our first question. And we're really curious in where you all are joining us from today, geographically speaking. And so we'd love to kind of see if it's a city or state where you're hailing from. Please let us know in the Slido app and we'll kind of be able to see who got up the earliest this morning for this session. See a lot of Washington, D.C., Connecticut, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Waterloo, Canada, California. All right. Ohio is a really good representation, it looks like, across the map and across the time zones. Thanks, everyone, for taking a minute to share that with us. Okay, the next question that we are going to ask you, we'll ask that you would respond in Slido, is what best describes your role? So we know that the Better Buildings Summit attracts lots of building owners, folks that work for building owners, as well as contractors, service providers, equipment manufacturers, program administrators. So we're kind of curious of the mix of folks that are on today's call. A lot of researchers. Feels like I'm watching the Kentucky Derby again. And a lot of other. Okay. So it's great to see that there are a lot of designers on the call today. Well, thank you guys all for joining us. All right. All right, thanks for that. So we will move back to our PowerPoint slides. We'll be using the Slido for some more kind of in the weeds questions in a bit that gets into some of the content that we're discussing. So as you know, the title of this session is about the role of architects, engineers, and contractors to deliver zero carbon buildings. I know that's a thing that zero carbon buildings are something that I think a lot about. I think increasingly more of us do. And so traditionally, Better Buildings has really been a partnership program, I would say for the most part, with building owners and folks that represented building owners. We've had a financial allies piece of that, and well as some other sub-programs as part of that. But we really recognized how important the role of these folks were in delivering the buildings that we want to and really need to build. And so this goes for both new construction and retrofits, I would say, but the decisions and the skill sets of these folks in the AEC community, I'll say, really impacts building energy use, obviously, their carbon emissions, operating costs, and the comfort. And we know that this community can play a key role in really enabling and helping building owners achieve their energy and climate goals. So this really critical stakeholder group to enabling these better buildings, we saw as a really wonderful time to engage them and really think as a community how we can scale those promising solutions more broadly. So that caused us to launch a new initiative last year called the Design and Construction Allies Program, which we launched last year. And Paul and Sammy from NREL helped me lead this effort, and I'm going to turn the slides over to them to tell you a little bit more about this effort and what we've done so far.
you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you, Paul.
Okay, great, thanks. I was struggling with my mute button there, and I'm sure others have done the same in the past. Well, thanks, Sarah. Want to just thank everybody for joining today. And as Sarah mentioned, you know, we started looking, a lot of Better Buildings works with owners and operators of buildings. They're the ones that pay the energy bills. They're responsible for that. They're trying to meet greenhouse gas emissions targets. But as we dug into this, a lot of it had to do with design decisions that were being made, that those people that own buildings then hire design professionals, hire contractors to actually implement what they want to do. And so we launched this effort last fall, kind of with a smaller cohort. And one of the things is, if you're interested, we'd love to talk to you more about this program. This is a screenshot of our website. And so going to the next slide. And so from a programmatic goal point of view, you know, one of the things that I like to think about here, and often questions that I ask is, like, what is stopping us from getting to zero-ready buildings today? And again, as Sarah mentioned, that could be energy and or carbon, or just having a substantial impact in how much energy a building uses. You know, what's stopping us today? And that really then starts to identify what the barriers are to do that. So this group has started looking at barriers and trying to address those barriers so we can deliver more zero-ready buildings. But it's really about making this routine. There are lots of zero buildings out there today in one form or another, but lots is somewhat relative to the whole building sector. And so really thinking about what it takes to make this routine so that it happens every day, really the goal would be with every building. So next slide. So Sammy?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So as part of the Design and Construction Allies effort, we now have 11 firms that have signed the agreement to date since the launch of the program. We do have other firms, about 13 other firms that are really actively involved as well, and they're engaged and and we know they're sort of working internally to get the agreement signed as well. But at this stage, we are looking for more participants. So if you're interested in joining, please visit the program site. We have it displayed here on the slide on the right for more details on how to do that. In the next few slides, we'll also sort of discuss the level of involvement that is expected from the allies. So stay tuned for more information on that. Next slide. So this here is just a visual of the major stages of the program, just to give you a sense of our approach. So you can see the first 3 stages have check marks above them because they're essentially completed. The first stage was really centered around working with the allies to set goals for designing and delivering zero-ready buildings and putting together metrics of success that are sort of quantifiable and measurable against those goals. The next completed stage was identifying the barriers that come in the way of routinely designing and delivering zero-ready buildings, which I'll actually talk about in a little more detail in the next slide. We then formed 2 working groups around the barriers to really take a deep dive and really identify the resource gaps and develop missing solutions that are needed to address those barriers. We're expecting the allies to then implement the solution and provide feedback on what went right and what went wrong, and help with disseminating and scaling the solutions for broader adoption and impact. So next slide. So one of the first things we did as part of the Design and Construction Allies is we asked the allies to identify and rank order barriers on a relative scale to delivering zero-ready buildings. And this here is a result of that exercise. What we found is that the results are consistent with larger studies that are conducted in the literature. It's important to note that some of the barriers are intertwined, but it was interesting for us to find out that the design and delivery community does seem to struggle with higher perceived costs. You can see that bubbling up at the very top there. And they also sort of struggle with lower demand from their customers. Another interesting point here is they've also ranked technology limitations as sort of the lowest on this relative scale. Next slide. So working groups. So at this stage of the program, we have formed 2 working groups around barriers that were sort of prevalent, that we can make substantial impact of address, and that can be addressed by the group. So these 2 working groups are shown on the right. The first one is centered around cultivating client demand, which really encompasses a few of the top ranked barriers from the previous slide. And the next working group is centered around developing solutions to address embodied carbon considerations in the design and delivery process. Next slide. Yeah, Paul, maybe you can let us know kind of how to get involved in that.
Sure. So, we currently have a group call once a month, sometimes it's every other month, and we're really focused in working out solutions. So, one of my challenges that I bring to the group is we have barriers. In fact, we've spent a lot of time identifying lots and lots and lots of different issues and barriers. And really, we're trying to shift now, and our panel will talk about this in a minute, but how to shift that into how do we solve some of these things, and what can collectively we do to get through some of these barriers. And again, like I said earlier, make this routine. So it's participating in those working groups. Those working groups are meeting about once a month. And like a lot of good programs, the more time you put into it, we hope the more that you get out of it. And so that's really what's involved for the allies. And it is limited to design firms and contractor firms. And so I know there's a lot of owners on the line too. As this builds out, I would encourage you to go to the website and use this as a resource for owners, right? Because ultimately we need everybody involved in all these decisions made in order to really achieve a difference in how buildings are designed and delivered. And the owners are a really important part of this, right? In working with these allies to validate the solutions and show that they're really working, showing through case studies and measured data that we can get the performance that we want to have. And then another important part for owners is really let us know. We'll provide contact information at the end. What some of your needs are, what you see some of the challenges here that we can bring back to this group. So look forward to others getting involved in this effort. So next slide.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Sammy. So we're going to go back to Slido here for a minute. And we have a question for folks. So for folks that are on the line that do have buildings or are, are influencers to the decisions building owners make, how likely are you to build a zero ready building in the next 5 years? There's 4 choices here: maybe, definitely, not likely, or highly likely. I didn't really say those in order as we're watching these results come in. And I should probably add to build or retrofit a zero building, because certainly a lot of this is very relevant for retrofits as well as new construction. All right.
And again, as we go through these.
Oh, so go ahead, Paul. Please.
Yeah, just as we go through these, I mean, these are fascinating results, right? Especially think about, and maybe I will challenge the not likelies, right? What are the challenges out there, in doing this? And bring some of those tough questions to the panel a little bit later in the presentation.
Agree. So it's interesting to see that, over a quarter of you are saying definitely. So there is lots of work to be done. And hopefully we can, learn about some of the strategies that the folks on the line have used to deliver some of those buildings in the recent past. All right, so we'll go to the next Slido question. Thank you for those that are participating. As an owner or decision maker, how confident are you about finding the right design and contractor teams to provide zero buildings? So, you know, if you did have this goal, do you feel like you could find the right talent to help you design and build these high performance buildings? Okay, so it looks like the leader was the one smack dab in the middle, the somewhat, from like a certainty to not at all. Looks like most folks are in the middle. Okay, so we will hope to give you some tools so that you can find the right talented skill set to help you, you know, get the buildings that you're hoping to add to your portfolio. Thank you. And then we have one other question before I turn it over to the panelists. The last question is, and this is going to be more of a word cloud, so blank answers to put in. What do you as an owner look for when hiring designers and contractors for your projects? Interesting. So I'm seeing experience is kind of the, looks like the runaway winner. We also have like passionate for climate action or passion for climate action, innovation, creativity, low bid, longevity, quality, knowledge, experience with a particular type of project. Okay, so it seems like there's a lot around experience, knowledge, qualifications, obviously some other responses here too. But so I think we'll kind of tease out maybe a little bit later, like how would you gauge experience, right? Like what are the markers that you would look for or metrics to really try to get a handle on that? So thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts with us on this. I find this really interesting. So I appreciate your involvement. Okay, so like I said, if you're having any issues, please let me know, panelists or attendees with the tech function. But at this point, we're really going to turn it over to three really wonderful professionals that I feel grateful to have the chance to work with through this effort. Ryan Jang of Letty Madam Stacy Architects was representing kind of what some of the leading architects and what he's going to tell us a little bit about from an architect's perspective, how they can add value and some of the strategies they've used to achieve these high performance buildings. Then we'll hear from Stet Stanborn with the Smith Group from an engineer perspective around some of the same areas. And then Ryan Poole from DPR Construction about the role of your builders and how they, and construction firms, and how they can really help bring the project across the finish line to deliver you some high performance results. So with that, I will turn it over to Ryan Jang.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you all can hear me. And I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, to the Department of Energy for including us and all the speakers. This is a really exciting opportunity to speak with you here today. I am a principal with Letty Madam Stacy Architects. Good morning from the West Coast. It's a little bit earlier here than it is for some of you over on the East Coast. We're a medium-sized architecture firm in San Francisco. There are about 40 of us. Next slide. And we are architects. We focus on what we call mission-driven work. And just this generally means that our clients have a specific disposition or an agenda as an organization, and the buildings that we create for them really are geared to support that disposition and serve that agenda. In terms of typology, for us, that means working on a lot of housing that's mainly affordable and supportive. A lot of our clients here are nonprofit developers, and some of the different types of housing includes housing for special groups like veterans or the formerly homeless, transitional housing, or even those with special needs. Education projects for us include K-12 schools, as well as a higher education project. And one challenge here is really designing a building and its performance to complement the pedagogical and academic goals of a given institution. And finally, our community projects, we work with nonprofits or local municipalities, things like community centers and libraries. Many of these projects are adaptive reuse, which repurpose existing buildings. And so none of these two projects are the same, but one common thread that we bring to each project, and that any architect should bring to a given project, is really a high regard for both social and environmental responsibility. And we've been doing this for a while, but increasingly we're trying to look for interesting ways that these two things are interdependent upon each other. So next, Paul and Sarah asked us to focus a little bit on how owners, the first question here, can enable architects to do their best work. And there's just, three simple things here on this slide. The first is the 2030 commitment. The 2030 commitment by the American Institute of Architects is a group of almost 900 firms that are signatories to this. And these firms are committed to zero energy buildings by 2030. And there are increasingly aggressive metrics year over year, 5 years over 5 years towards this goal. So we get there, gradually. And for building owners, firms that join the commitment state that they explicitly value sustainability in building performance in a simple way to demonstrate alignment if you as a building owner have those same goals. The metrics are standardized, and we can compare our projects to each other. We can compare against across building typologies, and kind of differentiate between different climatic or geographical locations. And it always happens, but sometimes we track all our projects and not all of them meet the standards for the given year. So it helps us focus resources and efforts on where we might understand what we can do more to think more creatively about typologies that might be more difficult than others. Taller multifamily buildings, for example, are a little bit more difficult. The second thing here is about a climate action plan. And we know that every company, every building owner has a mission, has core values, has a distinct culture. So we would ask the question, and you might ask your architect, how might environmental sustainability complement or amplify your company's overall goals? Whether it's with regard to recruitment and retention of employees, saving on building operating costs, creating healthy indoor environments, prioritizing wellness, even stakeholder expectations. So beyond being energy efficient and meeting the needs of these occupants, we really look in our buildings to tell a story about those who inhabit the buildings and the organizations that they serve. The image here in the middle is Jacobs Hall at UC Berkeley. It's an engineering building that has all sorts of cool stuff in it. It has laser cutters and 3D printers and everything else. And this building is really always in a high state of energy, both literally and figuratively. Its distinctive architectural features, this PV array, forming a large overhang on its sloped roof. And so when we conceived of this idea, we knew that this building would be used by engineering students to tackle society's biggest challenges. We thought it would be an aspirational statement to allow the creativity of the users inside the building to literally be powered by the sun's renewable energy and expressed by this roof array. And finally, expressing, ask your architects how to prioritize risk and resilience future-proofing. Buildings last for a long time. We want them to adapt and perform well over time. And beyond, again, reducing operating costs, we work with our clients often to identify possible hazards that a building or that users might face through the life of the building, ranging from climate change, earthquakes, extreme weather, even pandemics. So how might the buildings respond to these hazards, and what specific design strategies might we build in from the beginning to mitigate them? Sometimes this influences the structural systems of the building and its aesthetic, such as this community center in Oakland shown in the image on the right. It'll be made of mass timber as a carbon reduction strategy, and it's engineered to be more resistant to resist seismic activity than what code requires. The neighborhood can come here during an event such as seasonal fires or a power outage and be safe and have a place of refuge. Next slide. And finally, we can get into this more, I think, during the discussion time, but just a few strategies to get to zero. The first one, of course, is low embodied carbon. We discussed this a little bit in the previous slide, but embodied carbon is becoming a more significant priority beyond energy efficiency, and understanding structural systems and how they might meet the building's needs, and how they might also help to get to a lower carbon alternative than from one structural system to another. Electrification and passive survivability. More and more municipalities, at least in California, are going all electric, looking to omit natural gas and other fossil fuels as a source of energy. The grid is becoming increasingly greener and more renewable. Of course, a related question is how a building can continue to shelter inhabitants for an extended amount of time after power loss. This might mean backup generators, still relying on fossil fuels for a while. Our university clients like to go this route. Other buildings, smaller buildings, might be able to utilize battery backup to on-site photovoltaic arrays. Beyond zero and housing equity. No matter what type of building you operate, even if it's not housing building, we know that social and environmental equity are inextricably linked, and we know that climate change disproportionately affects those who are economically disadvantaged. So for our communities to really thrive, and for all types of buildings and businesses to thrive, I think it's kind of incumbent upon all of us to really prioritize housing equity and a place to live as a basic need for everyone in our communities. And finally, ask your architects how they are activists in their own communities. What issues do they advocate for? How do they care about them, whether it's sustainability or something else? This is something we talk about a lot with our staff, and how a project or an architect might think beyond the property lines of that project, and how we as citizens might help bring about a more green and equitable future for everyone. So that's it for now, and I'm happy to talk more when we get into the discussion section. I'll hand it over, I think, to Stet at Smith Group now.
Thanks, Ryan. So hi, everybody. My name is Stet Sanborn. Like Ryan, I'm actually also located in San Francisco, and I'm a principal for Smith Group, and I lead our engineering team for sort of Northern California. We can go to the next slide. I've been working on sort of all electric and net zero energy buildings for pretty much the last 17 years or so. And that's partially why I actually joined Smith Group a number of years ago, because of sort of a joint passion around sustainability and also sort of aggressive research and development along trying to move net zero energy buildings. So our firm in particular has joined the Allies Group and has been quite active, in large part because of sort of the climate crisis that we're in, but also in large part because we like to help our clients do risk assessments and sort of build the highest value that we can into the projects that we build for them. And for owners, especially owners that plan to hold their assets for a long period of time, we want to make sure, as Ryan was talking about earlier, that those assets are resilient to change, and so that we do the right thing on day one, and we can reduce how much rework is required later on, or sort of change out of systems over time in response to both increasing temperatures, or in the case of projects on the West Coast, increasing risk around wildfires, smoke resilience, and indoor air quality. So all these elements around sort of climate smart design are actually all interdependent. And so there's both an interdependency of energy, water, air quality relative to climate change, but also layered in on that is a time value of carbon. And this is a concept, if you've heard Larry Strain at Siegel and Strain Architects talk about the carbon that we're emitting right now through our construction efforts, whether it's embodied carbon for construction or existing buildings and their operational carbon. The carbon that is happening right now is exceptionally important, and far more important than necessarily the carbon that we're going to emit in 60 or 70 years. And so we have a huge focus at our firm right now on sort of doing two things at once: dramatically reducing our embodied carbon through construction. The image here is actually a project that we partnered with DPR in their Sacramento office, using properly sourced low embodied carbon CLT construction, but also a net positive energy retrofit. So existing buildings, doing modifications to them with low embodied carbon materials, and then layering on top of that, going beyond net zero. So all electric, net positive energy design with battery backup. So we're trying to focus our attention on this because we see that as twofold. One, addressing climate crisis right now, but also helping our clients, again, and building owners put as much value into the assets that they plan to hold. Next slide. So one of the quick questions that we were sort of thrown at us were, how can owners enable AEC firms to do their best work? And Smith Group is an integrated AE firm, so we have architecture, engineering, landscape architecture, so the whole gamut, interior design. And we get asked this question a lot. What would we like to see in an owner for these projects that we're doing that are all electric or net zero energy, net zero carbon? The first thing that I would say is, when you're issuing your RFPs, include that requirement in the RFP. Instead of saying, we'd like to study this and we think it might be a potential goal or a stretch goal, I would just emphatically say, this is the project requirement. And by doing so, it sort of addresses Sarah's earlier question that was in the Slido about your confidence level and your ability to attract the right team. If that requirement is in the RFP, first off, you're going to start to attract the attention of like-minded folks that are interested, and definitely bring that experience level. And it provides that baseline for you to actually start to measure that experience. So all the teams that are coming forward are bringing sort of their best game around net zero energy, low carbon design, et cetera. And so just putting that as a project requirement, I think, is going to elevate the conversation. And during the selection process for finding the right team and the right cultural fit for your project, at least then everybody is bringing to the table that base level experience and being able to deliver net zero energy buildings. The next piece is, which often isn't discussed, and it's really around transparency within your pro forma. So, oftentimes in sort of traditional building delivery, the owner and the developer side have kind of a opaque wall around their finances and how the project is actually going to be procured, and what financial mechanisms are needed to deliver that. I would say when we're starting to focus on net zero energy and low carbon buildings, one of the best things that you can do is actually bring your design team into the fold and discussing some of the limitations or struggles or challenges in how you're providing the financial mechanisms to deliver that project. And I say that because, especially on the energy side, there's a number of ways to actually deliver the renewable energy systems, for instance, to pair with your project, and that can pair specifically with how you plan to finance your project. And having us in the fold to discuss those strategies, rather than having a size a system or size equipment and then just throw it at you, and then you have to figure out everything on the back end. Bring us into the fold, because there are ways that we can bring to bear for the project that actually can make the financing side easier, or it can make your pro forma more beneficial. And that could be anything from helping you identify components that can take advantage of accelerated depreciation, looking at sort of modified PPA programs or power purchase agreements so that you don't have to put up that capital on day one for your energy component of your system, to a whole host of other sort of incentive programs that we know about because we're connected in a really robust way with local utilities. So I would say transparency works, and this is especially true on our projects that we do is either design build or progressive design build. That cost transparency between the contractor, the engineer, the architect, and the owner can actually deliver you a much better project at a lower cost and faster. And so there's a lot of benefits in opening up the books on both ends so that everybody can understand how you deliver the project. And the last item for this slide, we're often asked to just provide analytics. How can we get to net zero energy? What's our EUI? Are we going to can we offset on site, or do we need to offset our energy elsewhere? I would say beyond just those sort of fundamental questions around low energy buildings, there's a whole host of analytics that we can bring to a project that can align with your values or your tenant values or your staff values, depending on the type of project that we're building. And so one of the things that we get most excited about on the design side is when an owner is really engaged in the analytics of whether it's indoor air quality, net zero energy, facade performance, daylighting, all those components that go into how a building actually operates after it's inhabited. If the owner has a passion around any of those items or can carry passion in from the folks that are going to inhabit the building, then from a design standpoint, we're going to be much more successful in delivering you a project that's not only low carbon, but also meets all the other criteria that get people excited about your project. And that's what we're trying to do, is bring excitement around net zero. So it's not just like an add-on to the project, but it's integrated into the core of how the project is designed. So in the next slide, we're going to talk, I want to talk a little bit more about sort of some examples around how that analytics piece and the financial piece can actually help you make decisions as a building owner. So I'm going to use the example, as Ryan mentioned, resilience, especially in the West Coast right now, but honestly, after the Greco in Iowa this last year, the flooding out east this year, hurricanes. It's not just wildfires in California, although most of my experience is on the sort of West Coast. But resilience is incredibly important. And as we look at low carbon buildings, low energy buildings, and especially as we look at electrification, resilience is becoming an increasingly important topic. And when we talk about the financial mechanisms and why opening those books can help, is that the solutions that we bring to the table for low carbon or all electric buildings, the backup strategies even have different financial structures. And whether it's just purely a backup element, like a generator that just sits there every day, it sits there doing nothing. It costs a lot of money to sit there and do nothing. Once a month, you have to test it, which costs money and has emissions associated with it. But it's not an asset that brings other value. And so one of the things that we'd like to do on our projects in collaboration with owners is try to find strategies that meet their resilience goals, while at the same time providing additional value the other portion of the year. So rather than just being a backup component, can they provide value either in reducing energy costs or demand charges, et cetera, throughout the course of the year. So we do a lot of actually full life cycle financial modeling for resilience, and particularly for our net zero energy buildings. So this is just an example of comparing sort of the life cycle cost of a base case generator versus a generator plus a PV system. So again, that PV system in an islandable microgrid can provide you daytime energy while the sun is out. You can produce power, and so that can actually offset some of your backup power needs. Beyond that, it's actually providing a benefit throughout the rest of the year. So again, sort of looking for those larger benefits. And in the case of clients that want to go completely carbon-free or move off of operating carbon, we definitely are doing quite a few islandable microgrids with batteries, PVs, and sometimes also a generator. But these three scenarios are looking at both how to reduce carbon emissions throughout the year and do it at the lowest levelized cost of energy that we can. And it depends on it's highly dependent on where you are, which portion of the country you're in, what tariffs your utility structure have set up, and what incentive programs are available, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit. All of these things come to bear, but that's why the transparency and how you are going to procure your project is really important, because we can help you, we can be your allies in actually delivering you cost-effective solutions that fit within your pro forma model. Next. So I just put in just some of our high level, this is sort of our generic roadmap that we use for almost every project in trying to achieve net zero energy or certainly reduced energy costs. So the first one, even though solar panels are sexy, the cost is falling, they're great, we still start with fundamentals and first principles on reducing energy loads. So that tends to go to focusing on really high performance enclosure systems, building envelopes, and reducing our internal loads through appropriate equipment specifications. And that even includes, on the owner side, owner procured, owner installed equipment. So we do a lot of laboratories and hospitals where the owner is specifying equipment that's going to be coming in the building. We do a lot of work to actually work with our owners to find the lowest energy versions of those that meet their project goals, meet the requirements of the project. And we can often cut the internal loads from plug loads even by almost half, just by focusing on specifications for that type of equipment. we definitely focus on climate analytics and do a lot of parametric modeling to sort of find the best sweet spot for systems and that envelope. And then we have obviously a bias towards low entropy systems, so radiant systems, chilled beams, systems that we can provide heating and cooling at mild temperatures because we can get the best performance out of those. We're always looking for heat recovery sources, whether it's exhaust air from fume hoods off of a lab, or whether it's sewage heat exchange, like we did at the DC water headquarters. On-site storage and on-site renewables are now increasingly important for resilience and also grid alignment. So the grid connected efficient buildings, or GEBs, is a huge focus of ours in making sure that we're doing buildings that align with the grid and can drive more value, not just for the building owner, but also for the larger utility sector as well. So these are kind of our generic strategies that we go through for every project, but we like to establish these goals with you as the owner or with the other design partners on the project. I think that's it for me, and I think I'm handing it off to my friend Ryan at DPR. Oh, wait, sorry, last slide. Oh my God, I totally forgot. Embodied carbon is incredibly important, not just operating carbon. And so I wanted to throw up this slide just to advocate for building reuse and advocacy around building retrofits for net zero energy. So this is my choose your own carbon adventure slide. If you're working with an owner, I would say advocate for reuse before new construction. We have millions and millions and millions of square feet of existing buildings that are low performance. And if we really want to make an impact on climate and carbon, then I would be advocating that we should be tackling those projects first instead of just building new net zero energy buildings. Let's build old net zero energy buildings first. So with that, I'll hand it off to Ryan.
Thank you, Stet.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stet and Ryan, for teeing that up. And I'm glad you got your last message in there, Stet, because it's a great one, right? And I think, one thing that you guys are gonna see through all of this is that there's a lot of commonality between what Stet and Ryan and I are talking about. It's just difference in perspective, So I'm glad that we're all coming together. And again, Ryan Poole here from DPR Construction, and I lead sustainability for us globally. We're a contracting firm that has offices all throughout the States and some in the EU and Asia as well. And technical builder, we do self-perform some work as well. But really pride ourselves on sustainability and being a sustainability leader in our space. And so I'm excited to kind of talk to you today about some of the things that we're doing in-house. One being we have a group of over 100 people that we call environmental advocates that have various roles. So all kinds of different roles in our company, but people that are passionate about continuing to push forward as well. And then over 600 accredited professionals within our organization as well. And go to the next slide. Yeah. So I want to come back and really hone in on this one message that both Ryan and Stet mentioned as well, but collaboration and early collaboration is key to success. All of our research has continued to point back to this, that an integrated project delivery with an integrated team, understanding the goals early all together and looking at constructability as we go through design and cost aligned with that is paramount in being able to achieve the goal of creating a high performing building at market rates. The earlier we can all sit down and plan together, the better aligned we're going to be throughout the entire project and be able to deliver you your goals that you're trying to get towards. It's often that we're kind of faced with, coming towards the end of the design and then having to be the bad bearer of news to say, hey guys, we've got to sit down and do some value engineering here because we're over cost and we've got some constructability issues, right? So just want to really focus on the importance of bringing all of your engineering, architecture, and construction firms together at the beginning of your project to create a collaborative team that can work through the entire process together. Focus on strategies that are economic for your specific project. And here I've got to get a shout out to some of my mentors within our company. So actually Dean Reed and Atul, who are both leaders at DPR, help co-author a book with two Stanford professors that is actually the book on integrating project delivery. And so if you haven't read it, it's a great book that kind of goes through and tells you how the system works as you continue to integrate and the benefits from it. And go to the next slide. So the other thing that I really want to leverage is, at DPR, we tried to do something a little more unique and trying to provide the industry with really great data on how to build, high performing buildings. So we took some of our own office spaces. So we have 6 currently and a couple more on the way, which I'm really excited about. And so these are all of our offices here that I've got listed are net zero energy. All of them are also in different climate zones. So they all took different strategies to achieve net zero energy. They all have their own accolades and everything as well that we're really excited about. But one thing that I want to reiterate that the design partners talked about here was driving down your energy use intensity. The first and foremost strategy should not be, let's get everything that we want in the building. Let's, and then just provide, renewable energy to account for it. The best strategy is to continue to drive down your energy use intensity to begin with, so that then we have the flexibility to add and grow more as we continue to grow your programming. It also continues to drive towards the resiliency piece. And making sure that your space, no matter what the challenges lie ahead of us with energy in the future, your space could be able to provide that energy on site, or at least at a significantly reduced energy use intensity, so you aren't subject to fluctuations with energy charges within the future. And another thing that I also really want to play up that Steph mentioned was, and Ryan as well, which is, the amount of building stock that we already have available. The most sustainable building and high performing building that you can build is one that already exists. If you really, really want to look at lowering your embodied carbon, use the materials that are already there. So each one of these offices here are also an adaptive reuse project. Some of them have really interesting stories. They used to be our Phoenix office actually used to be like an adult video store. And, another one used to be, was an abandoned warehouse. So they were spaces that were at the end of their life from most people's perspective. But turning them into something new and beautiful, lowering the carbon throughout that is a really exciting thing on the back end. So though we have to continue to build new because we're going to continue to grow, I totally agree with Stet and Ryan in that, let's look at adaptive reuse on the front end. Let's look at existing buildings and how we can continue to drive those towards zero energy. So I wanted to bring this full circle too with embodied carbon. So the net zero energy side and looking at an operational carbon things, but we've learned, over the last decade or so that operational carbon is obviously continues to be a huge piece of it, and we're battling that challenge. But one challenge we haven't been battling is head on is embodied carbon, and it makes up a significant portion of the carbon that we have within our world. And so building materials, main building structures are the most carbon intensive within your building. And so there's been a big focus on how do we really drive lower embodied carbon materials within the industry. So, trees and wood, for instance, have a unique place in this because it's one of the only renewable resources that we have to build with, and it naturally sequesters carbon. So throughout its life cycle, through photosynthesis, it'll actually sequester carbon. And then as we harvest that wood and process it, it continues that carbon that's been sequestered in it throughout its lifetime can then be stored in the building product. So here you see some really awesome pictures of our new Sacramento office that used certified cross-laminated timber. And we did some calculations, to figure out, well, how much carbon did we actually sequester from utilizing mass timber? So here we actually had 55 metric tons of CO2. That equated to about 200 ton per square foot. And so I ran a quick calculation. I said, well, hey, what's the building stock that's left to be expected to add into the world is 2.5 trillion square feet, between now and 2060. So what would we do if we actually looked at, the magnitude of carbon within that? Just to say we took the same strategy we did with that at our Sacramento office. And what does that look like, right? And so it equates to 116 million tons a year. We've got some really great diagrams here at the bottom that show, that one DPR office, the amount of carbon that we were able to sequester from choosing low carbon building materials can power 14 homes for a year and is the equivalent of taking 33 cars off of the road. And so that same equation looked at from the global building stock is the equivalence of 29,527,273 houses powered per year and about 69 million cars off the road. So, an incredible impact that we get here from those. And yeah, just want to say that, mass timber is not the only solution. We're seeing incredible things happen within concrete, steel, all kinds of other major building materials. Concrete particularly, you can see recycled glass pozzolan being used as a replacement for cement. Actually, even now have where we're putting air scrubbers on industrial stacks and turning that carbon emissions into a liquefied form and using it as a binding agent. And then there's actually another organization out there near Stettin Ryan in the West Coast that's turning it into aggregate. So they're actually taking the liquefied carbon and then turning it back into aggregate so it acts as a cement. So incredible things are continuing to happen to lower embodied carbon, not only in main building materials either, but also in your furniture, finishes, and other products that you use within your building. So there's a continued focus. We've got to continue to leverage the momentum that we have to drive towards zero carbon solutions in operations and embodied carbon as an entire industry. And so I'm excited about the future and collaborating with my friends like Stettin Ryan and other design partners in the Department of Energy as we continue to figure out the proper solutions so we can provide these at marketable rates so it's economical for everyone to be a part of the solution.
Thank you so much, Ryan and Stet and Ryan. Those were fantastic presentations. And I think you gave us some really tangible tools and ways to, bring out the best in your skill sets and your teams. So thank you so much for all of those presentations. We are going to kind of turn it back over to a bit more kind of dynamic, interactive format for the remainder of the hour, excuse me, or the remainder of the 90 minutes for the next half an hour. And we're going to put up a couple more Slido questions. And as folks are taking the time to answer this, I'll ask the first one. So if you're an owner or work with owners, have you included energy performance specifications such as an energy target in your instructions to design team or into procurement documents? And that's, I know, something that Stet mentioned as a real kind of key strategy. And I think as we're getting those responses, I'm going to look at some of the questions that were submitted to our panelists through Slido. And one of the first ones is, let's see, high performance buildings are seen as a premium and often more expensive to deliver than traditional buildings. And I think you all alluded to that in one way or the other. So how do we convince the market and owners and others in the market that it is possible to deliver high performance buildings on more projects, including those of low-income housing and light commercial? And I know Ryan Jang, who started us off, it sounds like your architecture firm has a bit of experience in that space. So I don't know, Ryan, can you kick us off with maybe some thoughts on that question, why folks respond to this poll?
Sure. And I know that each typology is a little bit different, and affordable housing is, fairly specific. But one of the unique aspects of the nonprofit developers we work with on this type of housing is that they own and operate their buildings for the life of the building, really. So they're not kind of developing a condo and then selling them off, or there's not sort of a 10-year type time frame to the work that they do. Instead, it's sort of a 50-year or more time frame while the residents sort of move in and out. So that sort of life cycle cost analysis and the idea that the first costs need to be balanced with the long-term cost becomes much more of a priority for this type of owner. I'd imagine it's sort of the same for other types of owners also that kind of hold on to the buildings for a long time. But we end up getting involved in those conversations really on about maintenance and about running the building and about BMS systems and sort of everything else like that, because these clients really care about that. And they are sometimes more willing to invest, in the upfront costs if we can demonstrate with our construction partners such as Ryan Poole, that the return on investment and that it's worth the while. So that's pretty, it's sort of pretty simple in that regard. I mean, the strategies and the technologies, I think, change over time and are a little bit different from project to project. But the idea that that you need to be concerned with the long-term maintenance of your building and operating costs is a huge priority.
Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate the fact that you used, Ryan, the term future-proofing, right? So, not making a huge investment to something that might be kind of obsolete or behind the times in a few years. I thought that was a great point too. Ryan or Stet, did you want to add anything to this question?
Sure, we both do. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I just want to capitalize, Ryan, on the aspect. Well, technology is evolving, right? So, PV is significantly less expensive now than it was, and it's significantly more efficient. It's continuing to grow, right? But one thing I want to key in on, and we all said it, is driving down the EUI, and we mostly focus on passive elements when we're doing that. Passive elements tend to be, less expensive than some of those other ones. They're not going to fade out with technological advances, and they're driving down your energy use intensity, so you don't have to pay for it on the back end. So I want to say, like,
oh, sorry, I was just going to say, could you give a couple examples of those passive elements?
Yeah, sure. I keep going back to some of our offices because I love talking about them instead, and you're right too. But the Phoenix office, for instance, has like a chimney stack, so it has a heat chimney up above it that actually circulates the air because all of the heat rises from it, and it uses really large fans at low velocities to help circulate that air. We have a labyrinth below our Sacramento office that Steph helped design. And so it actually circulates air below the space through a series of canals, if you will, to condition the space before the air gets pushed in. There's all kinds of other really efficient systems. Sted, I'll let you weigh in from there.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's really exciting, and especially when we're doing collaborative work where the contractor and the design team are on one team and getting to have that sort of back and forth. And our approach is not to add, but to move, and from a money standpoint. And so, we're working on a project that's pretty far into construction right now in Davis, California, for UC Davis. And then that project, there was a fixed budget. The budget, it wasn't going up, but the client, UC Davis, really wanted a net zero energy ready, low EUI building, but at that same cost that all of their projects are delivered at. And so we worked really hard at another project that we work a lot with DPR, but another project with DPR where, because they were transparent in cost, we are able to move money out of the HVAC bucket and put it into the enclosure. So it's actually one of the images that I showed in my deck that I'm pointing to, a true thermally broken R25 plus wall assembly, in non-combustible construction, all the requirements for commercial sort of scale buildings, but thermally broken, really high performance window, high performance glazing, shading devices, all of those things just sit there. And they have a very long service life compared to, say, a heat pump that may fail after, say, 15 years, 12, 15 years, where you have to replace it. So we were, again, because the owner said, yes, we're going to own and occupy this building, we went and moved money into the enclosure, but at the same time are doing real-time load analysis to downsize the mechanical distribution system. Instead of just just adding on high performance envelope and then keeping everything else the same, we're balancing it real time. And so moving money, reducing the complexity and the cost of the mechanical system, putting it into those things that just sit there and last 50 years. It's less of what can I strip out of a project or what can I add to a project. And for us, it's more about moving money into the high performance elements that have the lowest operating cost or maintenance cost. On that same project, it's a radiant ceiling project, classroom building. And so that tends to be considered a premium product. But because we got the loads low enough, we only needed about 30% coverage of the ceiling with radiant panels. And then we were able to reduce that further because we added ceiling fans. And ceiling fans do a couple things. We can reduce the ductwork because the ceiling fans, if they're connected to the BMS, they actually can just help distribute air at very low pressure drop. None. So we get better output from the ceiling panels because we have more convective air movement across the ceiling panels. So again, we can downsize the ceiling panels because we can use ceiling fans. We can actually reduce the cooling or let the cooling set point lift a little bit up to 78, 80 degrees because the air movement from the ceiling fans can balance the thermal comfort aspect. So it's about an integrated design, but it's also that collaboration with our construction team to find where the highest value is. How can we get the highest performance at the lowest cost? And it really does require collaboration.
Yeah, and in a true life cycle analysis, right? To be able to compare those elements. And one last thing, Sarah, I want to mention too, particularly to this group, is don't forget there's a lot of financing options available now too to help support low carbon solutions. So particularly, lots of changes within the financial sector, big, Vanguard, BlackRock, continuing to shift a lot of their portfolio towards ESG investing. So you'll see there are a lot of investors that want to help push, facilities towards this resiliency because they want their buildings that they're in and their assets that they're invested in to be resilient. So I don't want to discount too that, work within the project budget, but also know that there are financing options available.
Yeah,
as well.
Thank you for that. And the federal tax incentive called 179D for different systems was made permanent in December. So that's exciting. And so that's one other kind of pathway for kind of funding here too. So thank you guys. Those were all excellent examples, very tangible. So we're going to turn it back over to the poll and ask our attendees another question. So what would you, as an owner, if you are an owner or anyone else, like to see from your architecture, engineering, or construction firm to help achieve your goals? So what would you like to see from them to kind of make it easier for you to commit to high performance or easier to achieve those goals? So I will leave that up for folks to kind of ponder on and to fill in. And while we do that, I'm going to tease up another question that we've received to the panelists. Let's see here. Here's one. Can you provide an example of a zero energy ready aspect that furthered the owner's security requirements? It's kind of a tough one. There you guys, a little bit of a curveball, but interesting. I think, and I will say that we've been doing some work with schools, and I know one of the big concerns for schools that's come up is, very unfortunately around, shooter safety and things, and that being a big concern for schools and their construction, which is sad on a lot of levels, but a reality. And so I think that's, one area of potential intersection, but I'll turn it over to you all if you have some solutions to share here.
I would add one example that we try to do in parallel. So we do quite a bit of governmental work for Department of General Services for various governmental buildings, both at state levels and at the federal level. And obviously there's a lot of security requirements around blast protection from the building enclosure standpoint. And as buildings are going through retrofit needs to meet new security threats, we use that as a parallel time to also be looking at the same facade enhancements from an energy enhancement standpoint. So can that same enclosure that you need to do from a security standpoint, you're going to still do a retrofit, can you at the same time be boosting that for better low E performance, spectrally selective low E coatings as part of your built up IGU that still has fragment containment and all the things around security, but can we also get the high performance? Can we still do it thermally broken? Can we still do spaced out support clips rather than continuous bars? It's really a deep dive on the engineering side of that safe facade system, but at the same time, not forgetting that energy is a huge threat as well. There's a climate threat at the same time, not just blast protection. And so we try to pair up those renovations to be dual use. So we're not saying, do this one thing, spend a whole bunch of money on a facade reskinning of a building. Oh, by the way, now we need to go do an energy efficiency update. If you can do those things at the best time, you'll get sort of the best value out of the capital investment.
I think another way is on the interior of the building, and again, it depends on the building program, but we've been working on a number of engineering lab buildings recently, and the kind of HVAC systems and air handling systems within different programmatic needs of the building kind of vary within the building. Like the reception area, for example, is different than the open office write-up area, and more intensive than that might be a dry lab, and then more intensive than that might be a wet lab. So there's this idea of different energy needs depending on the program, and we've actually found recently. And of course, you know, one strategy, I guess, around the HVAC there is cascading air and sort of other things like that. But, you know, it's an interesting question, because then it makes me wonder how we can more and more bridge that with the kind of programmatic and security needs of that same building. And there seems to be sort of a parallel track where there's a public space that actually is well connected to the outdoors. It doesn't need a lot of energy. And there are other areas that are very private and very secure because of the research being done in them. And to link those two things, I think, you know, I think is something that the question means that we should think about those more in our projects, and and it just is a very interesting question.
Yeah, and Sarah, I'd just add too, you know, one simple example that comes to mind for me, particularly with schools, you know, but a lot of buildings is vestibule areas, you know, your entranceway. You develop it for security, but I don't think people realize, you know, if you have that vestibule space, it helps keep the air contained, so you're not losing a ton of your conditioned air whenever you're having people go in and out of the entryway. So you have it for security purposes, so that you can keep an intruder, you know, locked in a space before getting through the second space. But it also helps significantly reduce your energy load, so you don't have a bunch of your conditioned air moving in and out of the space. You know, and one other thing that comes to mind for me that's probably the biggest for security is I'm going to go back to resiliency on all this. You know, it's looking at it from a different security perspective, maybe, but security of your assets, security of power moving forward. You know, a lot of us have talked about office and stuff, but we have, you know, really large data center projects and healthcare projects and, you know, life science, pharmaceutical projects, you name it, that are also going towards zero ready with big battery backup systems so that they can be resilient and power through, you know, if they get into a situation like we had in Texas where, you know, PV system was not capable and ready of handling, you know, the cold conditions that we got. And there was a lot of loss of power, and people wanted to know, how do we prevent this from happening again? You know, how do we continue to drive towards resiliency? And that's your energy ready is the answer.
Thank you. Great answers again. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, Sarah, I don't know if we can go back to that last word cloud or not, but I think there's some opportunity here that was coming from the owners, and maybe the panel could respond to some of these. I especially like convince us, you know, give me more examples. Can the panel respond to some of these words and how the AEC community is ready to respond to this?
I'll just share, because I saw the include financing options. So one of the things that we've seen and sort of picked up on recently is, especially on the resilient side, on trying to find ways to help package net zero energy, low EUI, and resiliency all as sort of one product, is looking not just at the financing side, but also talking to some of the insurance, large insurance carriers and reinsurers. So the insurance companies for the insurance companies. Up until a few years ago, I didn't know that was a thing. But as I've been diving a lot more into this, is actually talking with the reinsurers and trying to find actual, you know, are they willing to provide a high resiliency product for projects that are going after these really high aspirational resiliency and low energy goals, so that the insurance premium is lower because the risk to that project has been taken on to a certain extent by the owner, whether it's for wildfire, power outages, flooding. Can we reshape the financial market and talk to your, you know, and talk to your actual insurance tree and talk to them about whether they have a product that's based on low energy and resilience. You know, more of the global insurance sector is looking at this really hard right now. And so we're sort of a trusted partner of going with you and talking to the both from the financing side and an insurance side on you know, what is the risk analysis for the project and how have we mitigated that and to what extent. So it's similar to seismic retrofits, that if you're in seismic country, we've had to do that for years, and there's benefits on the insurance side if you've gone through a thorough seismic retrofit. So I'd say we don't want to just look at finance, but also look at the full financial picture of a project and what its monthly costs are, where are the premiums going, and can any of those entities provide an incentive to do these low energy buildings.
You know, another way to that term, convince us. I mean, it's a great point, and I think is developing alternates through the design process and through the bidding process, regardless of your project delivery. So one way to be, sort of convincing is to propose something. We're all kind of in this because we want to be creative about these things, and we'll put those ideas out there. They need to be costed from a first cost and affordability perspective, as shown here in green. They need to be done in a collaborative way with our contracting and builder partners, and you need to sort of understand the energy return on it also. So then, if you have a series of, or a menu of alternates, and that get sort of well defined over the design process, as you kind of move towards your GMP or move towards construction or whatnot, then you can sort of pick and choose those, I think, within the design as it moves along, depending on what the priority is, and you can sort of choose by advantage, depending on what is most important and how much resource you have.
That's great. Thank you. I think we're going to go. We have a few more minutes for kind of discussion and polls. There is another poll I was hoping we could ask for attendees to respond to. And this is really, if I noticed when we asked initially how many designers there were on the call, there was quite a few. So we have a question for you all. If we can go to that on the Slido poll, is what would you, as either an architect, engineer, construction firm, like to see from building owners? And we heard from, 3 examples of these with the Ryans and Stet, but for other folks that are on the line, we'd love to hear from you too, through a word cloud. And why we do that, I will go to another question that was submitted from through Slido. So here's a question about demand flexibility in design. So we talk a lot about EUI and the importance of EUI goals and efficiency, but there's also a time element to when you're using energy, both from a cost and an emission standpoint. So any suggestions that you have, or any techniques you've used to look at shifting time of use to lower carbon intensive, lower expensive times on the grid?
Yeah, Stet, I'm going to let you jump in. I had one point, and I think it goes over so well to this, which was the other piece that you've got that we're really great at helping you with is negotiations with your local energy provider, so that you can understand how to best utilize your system. And this is a new conversation with a lot of energy providers too, right, in specific areas. So it can sometimes be a little daunting for them to understand, oh, you want to build a 1 megawatt, power system, and you want to feed load shed back into the grid so that you can make your system more affordable. And so there are those strategies as well that you can look into for continued return on investment, perpetual revenue stream from your actual energy system as well. So I think that'll tee you up, Stet.
Thanks, Ryan. And Stet, I know you could talk about this for hours because you're very well versed in this. If I can just give you a minute or two so we can get to the last couple of questions.
Yeah, I'll go super fast. I'd say if there are 2 frameworks that you're super interested in, you can do a Google of GEBS, G-E-B, which is grid efficient or grid connected efficient buildings. It's sort of a framework right now talking about how friendly your building is to the grid and how and strategies for load shifting. The other one is Grid Optimal from New Buildings Institute. They're both really great frameworks to help you navigate ways that your building can look at what we call load shift, load shed, and load shimmy, sort of different scales of how grid interactive your building is. I'd also say that, so there's a whole world of demand response, and there's companies now that will actually take your demand response capacity of your building and aggregate that with a whole bunch of other buildings to create a portfolio that they can actually negotiate with the utility for large scale load shifting. And then you get an actual, becomes a commodity or a tradable asset. And so you can actually take advantage of that and get paid for that ability. The last thing I'll put a big shout out for is taking advantage of the mass of your building. And specifically, if you have a high mass radiant floor used for either heating or cooling, that mass, there's a bunch of research that's come out and some field studies that have shown that you can actually shift your heating and cooling load over for more than 12 hours by taking advantage of the thermal mass of that slab. And so you can actually run your equipment when it's grid friendly, when it's carbon friendly, or when it's outside temperature friendly to get the highest performance, and rely on the building mass itself to actually provide a tremendous amount of load. So I'll cut it there because I know there's lots of questions, but if anyone's interested, I could talk about grid connected buildings and load shifting for days.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Stat. Very tangible pieces of advice and guidance documents. And I appreciate you also mentioning not just the active kind of control side of things, but also the passive strategies that can be helpful there too. Yep. So I'm gonna ask one more Slido question, and Mike, if maybe we can go to not the next one, but the last one for folks. So the last question is, from this session, what are you going to do perhaps differently given the information that you heard on this call? And we'll just leave this up for a couple of minutes here. After this, we're going to have a couple of minutes. I'll let folks continue to respond here, but we're going to try to summarize some of the tips that we heard for both owners to kind of, work towards these, low carbon, low energy goals, working with their teams, as well as some tips for designers and contractors. Kind of summary. And then we also have a number of additional resources with links at the end, which will obviously be part of what's cataloged on this session. And I think some of the things that get to more of the details around how do you pick an EUI target to include in an RFP if you want to, how would you find an appropriate target, and how would you go about kind of integrating some of this into procurement and selection. So we'll have some resources there folks can follow up on. So great. I love seeing that other folks might be interested in joining the Allies program. Great to hear about the action plan to get to zero energy, zero carbon, and looking at really measuring the EUIs of buildings in the portfolio. This is great. Thank you all for participating with us through that. Okay, so for the last few minutes, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to talk about a few of the tips for both owners and designers and contractors.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So, I think we've heard a lot of these things, and there are definitely resources out there. You can contact us for some of these resources, but on the owner's side, right, ask for energy performance and ask for what you want and ask for it early and kind of keep true to that course, right? And I think there were some questions on there about that communication. And I think if we had asked the panel about that, they would all say, yeah, give us EUI targets, give us those boundaries that we can meet. As part of that. So, and include those goals in procurement documents. Hire a design team and the contractor that then will deliver to that energy goal, and deliver in a price that makes business sense for you. As you're looking for design teams and contractors, ask them for what past EUI performance they've had. How did buildings work in the past? One of the things that we are encouraging through this is that designers have, that go back and ask for some of that data. And that works two ways, right? That owners need to be willing to share a lot of that information, especially on these highly successful projects, to show others that it can be done. And we saw some of that in some of the word cloud pieces. Be willing to spend more money in design, and use some of that and show that better design, if you plan it better, you're going to save money on the construction side. And so it's much easier to make changes on, quote, paper with a pencil and eraser than it is to change the way the concrete was poured or to change something about a building after the fact. And we heard some discussion earlier about, what is the total cost of ownership of projects, right? And that can be operational cost, it could be first cost. The panel also brought in things like insurance costs, and just a lower risk that if the grid goes down, what's my potential risk and exposure there? So next slide. And then kind of looking at the design and contractor side of this, and some of this is even if owners don't, necessarily ask for it, that, set energy goals for all projects, make it a challenge as a firm that you're going to do this, right? Many of the questions that came up, and we just touched on one or two of those, had to do with cost. Cost comes up over and over again, but that we can achieve zero for little or no additional cost. There are more and more case studies coming out around this. We had done some work last summer on the cost of K-12 schools and found that the energy performance of that building was really decoupled from the cost of that building. And the more data we can collect on that, that's some of the convince me, I think, that came up in the word cloud. And so the more transparency with that data, the more people sharing that data, will really help move this industry forward. Ask for energy performance in all projects. I made a comment about this a minute ago. As a designer, say, well, how did that work? What things worked well, what things didn't work well. Always be ready to provide design alternatives to get to zero. Use that as a starting point, right? What strategies can I use to get there? One of the things that we have been finding, and one of the panelists mentioned earlier, was the huge decrease in the drop of renewables, and especially photovoltaics on buildings, to the point that it is the incremental cost of putting the photovoltaics on is often less than a lot of other uncertainties we have about a project, including the overall cost estimate. And so, as a rule of thumb, renewables should be an add alternate on every project, right? And then, work together as a team, right? Between the designer, the contractor, and the owner. So next slide. So, so we've talked about these programs. I'll turn it back over to Sarah, but here are some links if you're interested in some of the efforts through Better Buildings.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I think most folks have heard by now that we are excited to Secretary announced the low carbon pilot for building owners to commit to a couple of their buildings to low carbon goals. So if folks are interested in that, there's the link. And then if you're interested in the design and construction allies, either as an owner to find out more about these firms and how to work with them and some of the strategies they're using, or as a firm to join, there is that link. And the next slide. There are a bunch of resources. I realize folks want to take a screenshot here, or this will obviously be archived with the session, but to support a lot of the strategies that we heard about. And these are both kind of like the soft skills of how do you sell this and how do you, do the procurement, to some of the more technical aspects too, can be found here in some of these resources. And I know we just have one more minute, so I'll cruise through this. So we will be Buildings webinar series this summer with lots of great topics found here, more in the Better Building Solutions Center. All of this and more can be found in the Better Building Solutions Center. And I guess as the final slide, I just really want to thank our panelists and all of our attendees for a great session. We've launched a short feedback survey in Slido. If folks would be so kind to spend 30 seconds to let us know what you thought about this session, what we can do more in this space. Your answers are totally invisible to other attendees, but I really just want to thank everybody for joining us today, spending the time. Please check out the Better Building Solutions Center and feel free to reach out to me, Paul, or Sammy with any questions or ways that you'd want to work together in the future. So thanks, everybody, and good luck for the rest of the summit. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.